Ed and Lorraine Warren investigated so many cases in their career, and there were actually places so scary that they swore they would never return there. Out of all of the cases that these guys investigated as a duo, there was one in particular that Lorraine was adamant she could never return to. Nestled in the very quiet town of Amityville, New York, this unassuming suburban residence has a bit of a dark and twisted history. In the winter of 1974, the Lutz family moved into this seemingly perfect Dutch colonial home, only to flee in terror just 28 days later. They claim to have been tormented by supernatural forces, unseen entities that left them sleepless, drained, and in constant fear for their lives. A year before the Lutz's arrival, the house had been the scene of a horrific mass killing spree. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had methodically killed his entire family in their sleep, claiming sinister voices compelled him to commit the heinous acts. Ed and Lorraine were called in to help with the horrors the Lutz family was experiencing, and during a question and answer session back in 2013, when Lorraine was asked what the scariest case was that she ever worked on, she said, "Amityville was horrible, honey. It was absolutely horrible." Apparently it followed her and Ed straight across the country, and she will never, ever go into the Amityville house ever again. And now that she's passed away, maybe you should follow her advice. As you might expect, this next story begins in the witching hour, the wee little hours of the morning. One night, very late at night, Ed and Lorraine were contacted by the Snedeker family, who had just moved into a house on Meriden Avenue in Southington. Specifically, the mother of the family unit and a niece who came to stay with the family were on the phone. What they found and bought was a big and seemingly welcoming home. But what they didn't know was that it was a former funeral home. Oh, and fun fact, the morticians at the funeral home were allegedly involved in intercourse-related acts with the corpses, and what used to be the showroom for the coffins was now where there were some young spirits living, which was just, down the hall from where you're hanging out, having brunch. The place where the bodies were prepared for the viewing. So the boys were the first to start talking about things they had seen and experienced, saying they were terrified. And at first the parents were like, come on, get over it. But the boys were so scared they started sleeping on the floor in the living room. Among the sounds the boys would hear were the sounds of chains pulling the coffins upstairs. Only thing was, there's no coffins anymore. So the woman who called the Warrens was terrified, and with the niece in a small bedroom in the back of the house, and apparently the covers on the bed were levitating at the time, like there was a fan blowing them around. Lorraine said that while the mother was on the phone with her, even more bizarre events started happening. The mother had rosary beads in her hands, and while she spoke, they were being pulled apart and falling to the floor. Thankfully, Ed and Lorraine went over the next morning with the family's priest. A blessing of the house didn't really do anything, and that's when the Warrens were like, hey, can we get a bishop involved? The church did send an exorcist, which seemed to do the trick. But not before one last hurrah from whatever was believed to be haunting the house, because demons don't like to give up without a fight. There was this big tree in front of the house, and half of the tree, with no wind, broke off and fell on the property. The family moved a short time later. Ed and Lorraine kept the rosary beads because they were like, hey, if this demonic spirit can touch a Catholic relic, that means it's been infested with something awful, and they didn't want to risk the beads spreading throughout the world and causing more damage. In this next perplexing case, the Foster family found themselves entangled with quite the evil artifact, a conjuring book. And what did it do? It brought all sorts of awfulness into their home. As per usual, the eerie events began when Lorraine Warren received a mysterious call from a Mrs. Sandy Foster in the middle of the night. But the phone kept cutting out, and she couldn't call back. The next day, Lorraine visited the Fosters and learned about the disturbing occurrences in their house. Turns out, Meg, the daughter of the family, had invited dark spirits into the home by dabbling in the occult, and the family was suffering because of it. Faucets were turning on by themselves. People were hearing phantom footsteps echoing throughout the house. Strange lights were flickering off and on, and there was weird sounds plaguing every night. And Lorraine Warren stepped in to confront the menacing presence, and they discovered that Meg's bedroom was a hub of occult activities. There were conjuring candles, there was all sorts of occult paraphernalia, and ritual books. So they sealed the room, removed the sinister artifacts, and as they worked to dispel the evil, they encountered a chilling telepathic feeling of dread and an inexplicable force preventing them from going up the stairs. Despite these challenges, Ed and Lorraine persevered. With holy water and prayers, they successfully cleaned the house of the malevolent entities and never ever went back. Jack and Janet Smurl of West Pittston, Philadelphia, claimed that a demon was haunting their home from 1974 till 1989. According to the couple, the demon attacked them, dragged them across rooms, and even threw their dog at a wall. After investigating the home, Ed Warren later claimed that he spotted a dark mass in the home, and he heard a voice telling him to get out. Eventually, the Smurls turned to a series of priests and claimed that the demonic entity went away. Well, for the most part, after a lot of prayers and exorcisms. So there was a happily married couple in their 30s that bought this old inn in New England. So Nathan, he traveled during the week, but his wife Alexandria was home all the time to take care of their 2 daughters. Not long after moving in, Mrs. Carlson and her daughter began hearing footsteps on the 2nd floor, where in the past, lodgers used to stay. During the afternoon and late into the night, they'd hear dragging, heavy booted footsteps moving all across the floor above them. Mrs. Carlson's older sister, who lived nearby, occasionally stayed overnight in the house, and she also confirmed hearing these footsteps. The Carlsons did have rooms set aside elsewhere in the house for live-in farm help, and these men would also hear these footsteps, walking in circles around their bed. Sometimes while Mrs. Carlson would be trying to sleep at night, she'd be awakened by the spirits in the home. They'd yank the covers off the bed while she was in it, and she later found out that the very same thing thing happened to the farm help, which accounted for why the men tended to quit so soon after they were hired. Eventually, the infestation phenomena upgraded into whisperings that could be heard behind closed doors. However, when Mrs. Carlson or her sister checked the room where the whisperings were coming from, there was never anybody present. Although these spirits projected words that were often audible enough to be heard, the woman could never identify the language that was being used. And as time went on, things only got worse. After the missus straightened up the house, knickknacks and other little items would never be quite where she left them. Outside the house late at night, lights would be seen in the attic, but there was no electricity up there. While painting a room one day, the heat was suddenly drawn away, and the missus felt a hand touch her shoulder. She got so angry, she threw the paintbrush in the direction where she believed the entity to be and said, "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you're not going to get me." Well, everything got worse. Things were happening pretty much daily because the infestation took hold over the house. The kitchen and the bathroom water faucets would suddenly turn themselves on full force at the same time. On occasion, Mrs. Carlson would hear 3 knocks at the front door, which, folks, that's the sign of an inhuman presence. And of course, she'd go to the door, but there'd be nobody there. On the second floor, a visitor reported seeing a snake on the window ledge after hearing 3 taps on the window, but there was no nearby tree the reptile could have climbed. Oh, don't worry, folks, it gets worse. So while living in the house, the Carlsons added a new addition to the family. And one night, while the missus was watching television in the living room, she heard this crazy powerful explosion, and when she jumped up to check, thinking that the furnace might have blown, she found the door to the new addition's room violently torn open. Objects were still swinging and vibrating, and the temperature in the nursery was similar to a meat locker. Though the spirits in the home had obviously tried to kill the new addition, thankfully the new addition survived. However, when the spawn got a little bit older, Mrs. Carlson was walking past him as he played with some knickknacks from the living room when he suddenly let out a loud shriek saying, "You stepped on Beatrice." Now, Mrs. Carlson put down everything she was carrying and she's like, "Who's Beatrice?" And he's like, "Oh, Beatrice is my friend who tells me what to do." Mrs. Carlson then told her son to ask Beatrice who she was, and after a pause, he replied that Beatrice told him to tell her that she's a witch. The mom took away the items the boy was playing with, and it sent him into hysterics. She tossed them into a basket in her bedroom closet, somewhere the boy was forbidden to go without her permission, and didn't think about it until later that night, when she was in bed by herself and saw a large, spooky form in the room with her. She described the entity as being darker than the darkest night, and it moved very slowly around the room, freezing her with fright. I didn't mean to be a poet, folks. Before the black mass went away, it transmuted into a globe of synthetic light, about the size of a basketball, while producing a deafening roar, which was once again similar to that furnace. And this went on for many nights, until the Warrens were called in. And like many other times, they took a tour of the home, blessed it, realized the knickknacks were tied to the entity, and took them with them. And that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident ooky spooky girly. See ya!